Welcome everybody. My name is Sebastian, known as Isikovic. Here we have with us one of the most representative person or fighter of the culture of electronic music. Not only that, but a part of being an incredible DJ, he's promoter, producer, label owner, an educator. I don't know if I'm missing something.
Oh, that's a great sales.
But we have Sunil Sharpe that he'll be playing in Quimera project tonight. Great venue here in Madrid that started a year ago, and a bit more than a year. How are you doing? Good?
Yeah, good. It's great. It's great to be here. It's I wasn't here. I was in Madrid not so long ago, and it was obviously it's a really big venue here. But this is something, smaller, community driven. I'm playing more of these type of shows and gigs and for
you those
like this, and I love the connection of meeting new people with it kind of who are quite like-minded,
Yeah, we are glad to have you.
Yeah. So I've had a really nice engagement so far.
Yeah, that's
enjoyed it.
So I wanted to thank Lucia and Cynthia for making this happen. Thank you for accepting you.
Of course,
for being here.
Talking.
And we'll be speaking about your beginnings, how you're doing with there in Ireland, getting to the parliament, about a bit of the scene, something of your label too, that is important.
Yeah.
And, if I'll start with the questions, is that all right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
The first one, I want to know you a bit more, is who is Sunil Sharpe? How do you find yourself?
I don't know. I think sometimes in music, generally when you're trying to kind of get somewhere and achieve things, you quite often have anything to do with like creative art or pursuit, something that isn't a typical 9-to-5 job. You tend to be juggling a lot of things, taking on a lot of things. And before you get to where you need to, you quite often have to juggle quite a lot of jobs, so I always sort of had that kind of in me, I suppose, as I was starting to try to get into the music scene and become a DJ and maybe get a job that I kind of liked. Because on your path to becoming a DJ, you could work in like a record shop or work in a radio station or any of these sort of things. And they were all kind of mini goals of mine along the way. But in order to actually kind of achieve the sort of, I guess, and reach my potential, I suppose, with certain things, that takes a while. That takes many, many years sometimes. And in order to get there and to sustain yourself financially as well, you have to balance a lot of different things. Yeah. So as I kind of became an adult and then started to grow as maybe an artist or as a DJ or whatever you want to say, I was just doing many different things. And I think it's just part of my personality a little bit. It always feels like you're doing too many things, but then when you leave something down, it doesn't feel like you're doing enough. So I think, that probably says a little bit about my personality, in that I'm always probably taking on a little bit too much more than I should be sometimes, but I'm not content if I'm not doing that. Well, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Oh yeah, but it's good that you've been doing lots of things. You're very active. Yeah. Like I said before, you're a fighter.
Yeah, tell me a bit.
And it's good how, I like that, how you find yourself.
Yeah. I don't overthink. I could overthink it now that you've asked the question, but I think, I juggle things, I suppose.
Good.
And, yeah.
The next question is, how were your beginnings with electronic music? Could you tell us some story about it, how you started, how you got into the electronic music?
Yeah, well, I didn't really have a particular time where I said, that's electronic music. There was one particular time, maybe, where I just remember the term being used a little bit more. It was when my uncle came back from Berlin in the early 90s, and he lived there at a really cool time, just as the wall came down. And he came back with a big piece of the Berlin Wall. And he also came back with a particular live album of Kraftwerk at the time and was telling me about them. Now, only that I started to kind of do a little bit of it. It wasn't straight away, but I realized later on that I had been already aware of them from when I was a bit young, like quite young. Because there was a few of their singles, like The Model and stuff like this, that were kind of commercially successful. And it was only after time when I kind of picked some of these out in the house that I realised, that's who he was talking about. But at the time, they were all sort of part of the whole kind of pop movement or synth pop movement, whether that was Soft Cell or Human League or other acts like that made their way into the pop charts. And I suppose up to that point, I listened to a lot of pop music or rock music or classical music as well, which is probably one of my main early passions, because I kind of grew up as an only child. And I think when you're an only child, sometimes you end up kind of having to find more stuff for yourself. It isn't always like introduced to you by, an older brother or an older sister. I didn't really have a musical background as such, but I was collecting a lot of music, whether that was tapes.
You already?
Yeah, I was. I mean, I was collecting like singles and stuff when I was quite young, like, vinyl singles when I was 4 or 5, initially. So I was collecting music when I was a kid, and I actually liked that. I remember my auntie bringing me into town sometimes on Saturdays, and I actually liked the whole idea of getting records and stuff like that. And then,
so then digging.
Yeah, and then there was also these things called flexi discs as well, which were like these really thin kind of records as well, almost like wafer thin records that you could play. And if I remember correctly, I had a small little record player, quite a small one that played singles on it. So that was much earlier though. That was when I was really like a kid. But so maybe that was an important thing for me in that I kind of knew what records were, so I always sort of felt comfortable about them.
You were quite young.
Yeah. I think it was kind of like, because I grew up with my around my aunties and uncles and stuff like that, and they would have and they weren't, in some cases, one of my aunties, she wasn't that much older than me really when I think about it, so she was almost like a big sister, so so I think I think that was good for me, having somebody like that. And she wasn't the only one in the family, but definitely from a music point of view of like, oh, let's go into town and
and look for music, right?
I'm getting records, and she was into like kind of lots of different music and stuff. We used to go out a lot as well. Actually, when I think back to it, she was the kind of one person in the family who sort of resembled a bit of what my future self would be, in terms of like being really, wanting to go to whatever good was on in the city and to go out late and all of that kind of thing. She was very much the kind of the me of her generation in the family.
With what age you start to your first DJ?
I started.
When did you saw the turntables and you went to get a mixer? When do you?
That was I've been thinking about it before that, but I think I didn't get turntables till about 96. I think it was
96.
So, and at that point. At that point, I'd been kind of mixing around in a friend's apartment at the time, and I was actually quite lucky. In my introduction to playing techno records and stuff were labels like Labworks and Platypus, and so it was kind of a lot of the kind of hard trance, hard acid, good trance, kind of psychedelic, trippy kind of stuff as well, because the lifestyle then as well was very much about the upper side of the dance stuff, but then also about the kind of trippier side of just listening at home, and so there was just a nice mixture. There's a friend of mine, Mark Gormley, at the time, who definitely was an inspiration on my kind of tastes at the time, and even though he was kind of more into the kind of the trancier, but maybe some techno stuff, he still had a good knowledge of techno. I mean, I think he was the first person to tell me about Trésor. Like, I'd just been out buying records for the first few weeks of like buying like techno records and knowing what the difference was between different labels. And I remember quite early on, he told me that was and they didn't maybe understand it as well, but I didn't. Again, I was just sort of like, I was kind of in my own world a little bit with it at that point, and that was when I discovered labels like Trésor. And even though I kind of had a great appreciation for the Detroit artists that were on the label, it was actually people like Neil Landstrom, Christian Vogel, Tobias Schmidt, at a later point probably Subhead. That was a few years on, but they were the artists that really really inspired me at the time, from a kind of a just what is techno and what it can be. And I think I said this before, to me that was almost like protest music within techno, because it wasn't following the conventional route or road or path that techno had done up till then. It was trying to put a really different kind of spin on it, and that was imprinted in my mind from really, really early on, that techno should be forward-thinking, experimental music, you know. But if you can make that work in a dance floor context, that's great. And I think at that point as well, I was also I was also reading a lot. I was reading a lot of magazines, reading a lot of interviews. I mean, I could probably tell you about multiple really important interviews from back then, including one actually in Music magazine with all of the old Detroit heads.
Magazines there were in that time.
Well, I remember obviously there were some of the bigger ones, like, you know, Mix Mag and stuff like that, but there was, Music was another big one. It was a big one, not far off in size to something like Mix Mag. It didn't last in the long term, but it did have some really good interviews in it, kind of quite because some of those big magazines, same in the way that DJ Mag is nowadays as well, is they might do that top 100 very kind of mainstream side of the culture and the industry, but on the other hand they have specialist writers that like go after the really interesting stuff as well. So it was like that with some of the bigger magazines back then as well. But there were particular ones. Eternity magazine was one, Wax magazine was another, Mate magazine was another. They were all English magazines. There was a couple of kind of local sort of fanzines and one Northern Irish magazine as well. And at one point then an Irish dance music magazine, which I went on to write for as well. But no, in the early days, Eternity, I'd say, was the main one, and that was largely down to Mark E.G. There was a guy called Alex Hazard as well that also used to write for them, and I quite liked his stuff. There was a few people actually. Russ Cox might have written for them as well, who was a DJ and reviewer. So back then as well, you had a lot of DJs, and in a way I kind of became one myself as well, who reviewed music. And because of their reputation from reviewing music and maybe the contacts they got with getting records from promotions companies and stuff like that, that kind of like bolstered or kind of like improved their reputation as a DJ as well. So people like Russ Cox, if I remember correctly, was somebody that wrote about music but also had a good reputation for being a DJ as well. So there were a lot of these kind of DJs, quite a few from the UK actually, because of the magazines that they were, who were just kind of quite respected in the techno scene, and who, and whose words really matter. But Mark E.G. was probably the main one for me. He introduced me to so much stuff, you know, and then there was other writers. I think he kind of had I think his writing and passion rubbed off on others within the magazine as well. Like that's where I would have read about like Force Inc. and labels like that for the first time, and how I became more familiar with Freddie Fresh and Communique and Woody McBride and all of these kind of people. But with the music, there was one particular music interview though I remember. It was with all the Detroit guys, from like Stacey Pullen to Keith Tucker, Juan Atkins, and it kind of had like a profile on all of them of what age they were, what their labels they were on. And what I liked about it as well was they were kind of like, they were complaining about the Europeans. They were complaining about Luke Slater. They're complaining about how loud the Swedish techno records were. No, maybe that was another interview actually. But what I kind of liked back then was the sort of the verbal battles that were going on between Detroit and Europe, and in a lot of ways Detroit were kind of like, listen, we're the source of this stuff, and people need to kind of respect it. And I got to say, at the time, and a few years on, I really got into the Swedish techno sound, and some of the producers like Kari Lekkebusch and Adam Beyer and a lot of these kind of people. And I didn't always kind of like how some of the Detroit acts were sort of were kind of backbiting them a little bit or complaining about them. But I didn't know about that. But I do understand it a lot more. I do understand it a lot more, especially with kind of, Black American music, and how, we know that the origins of so much of what it is that that we love in the culture, and what, how this music came about in the first place comes from cities like Detroit. But and Chicago, and further afield. But if you look at how well some of these people have been rewarded in the long term, they haven't, you know. And I suppose that's something that maybe I didn't fully appreciate back then. I kind of saw people complaining about producers who I actually liked, and it's kind of, I'd be thinking, well, can you not keep it positive? Like, their music's good, like, you know. But I suppose over time I kind of understood it. I did understand it then, but I think my appreciation grew over time, more for what some of them are saying, you know. But definitely reading a lot in the early days, and finding out about the personalities and the people behind the music and the cities and the scenes was really, really important, and definitely helped to kind of form my overall kind of mindset when it comes to tech.
So we see that the magazines, they help you?
Yeah, I think so. The arguments as well. Like, I like differences of opinion, and I think sometimes now people aren't always as willing to share their opinion or have a different opinion to others, you know. And sometimes it's very hard to have a respectful difference of opinion. I think that's been one of the problems with the internet that we've had to kind of grapple with a little bit, is that it's too easy to, it's not easy sometimes, especially people that don't know each other, haven't met each other in real life, to actually just have an exchange of views,
of opinions.
Yeah,
and it's difficult to accept that.
That doesn't result. It's all about winning, isn't it? It's all about winning in front of other people that are watching. But what I used to like about a lot of these other arguments or differences of opinion is quite often they were bringing people into the same room. And I just think that when you do that, and when you discuss something out in the open, in some cases it might become heated, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, that it ends up on bad terms or that the people are enemies afterwards. It just makes people think a little bit more. And that's what I used to like about that sometimes, was just that you had people in the room who respected each other but didn't necessarily agree with each other on everything. And I'm sure that's the way a lot of panel discussions go now as well. But I would say overall that people are probably often a little bit too polite or holding back in what they want to say sometimes, you know. And you, like, by being honest, it doesn't mean you have to be rude or insulting to anybody, but I do think sometimes you have to you have to challenge opinions and perceptions of certain things.
Some people, that they don't get wet, no, they're about saying things.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes what kind of happens now is like people who've been in the scene for a long time and they express opinions, and the general consensus then is like, oh, well, they're old or they're around for a long time and therefore their view isn't as valid or they're bitter or all of these things. In some cases, there might be a little bit of that, but I think in many other cases, and I'd say the majority, particularly when it's coming from other DJs and stuff like that, is they've seen and experienced something else. Yeah, you know, and they want to preserve that. I don't think it's good that things stay the same all the time, but certainly, you know, the values that maybe they held and that were maybe more common within the scenes that they were part of, when you start to see that kind of evaporate a little bit, there does come a time where you want to put up your hands and say that. So I do understand when some DJs, because I would know some of the DJs and some of the people who can be a bit more outspoken on this stuff online, and you know, they're saying it because they, you know, out of love really for something that they've put their whole lives into, you know. And I don't think necessarily that everything needs to be about older generations, you know, patronising or dictating to younger generations about what way it needs to be. But definitely, if we are on a kind of a different path now that is not necessarily going anywhere in particular, maybe sometimes it's good to hear from some people who have some other insights.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes difficult, you know, for the people that been a long time in the scene to accept what's happening now, or that's what you mean? Or
yeah, a little bit. I sort of think like that what happened, I think what kind of happened during the pandemic was what sort of happened was, excuse me, a lot of people were sort of on their own momentum and were maybe kind of like hanging on to their place or their space in the scene without being really challenged. And I think that was probably unfair on a lot of like upcoming acts and DJs. And you see it at every level as well, in local scenes as well, where there are DJs who, hang on to the slots in particular clubs and no one else gets to play there. So maybe, the pandemic in certain ways wasn't a bad thing for just in terms of an overall reset. But I think in between that reset happening, i.e. from when the pandemic started to when clubs reopened, we lost a lot of clubs. We lost a lot of connections, and trying to rebuild the scene has just been really, really challenging, I think, since then. And I think because a lot of those connections were also broken and lost because a lot of people moved on from music, I feel like some of the older people in the scene feel a little bit more lost because their clan or their community, it isn't quite the same, But if you look at our scene, even if it's just a techno scene, it's still a young enough scene, So we're now at the point where it is, though, getting a little bit older, and you're having people now that are bringing their kids out to gigs. And, you're seeing the generations now, which is interesting. So we're still in ways in the early stages of techno. I mean, it's not a form of music that's around as long as many other forms of music, but it's getting a little bit older now, I suppose, as well. And it's I guess because of that, and because of the sheer numbers of people that are actually into it, of all ages, it means that there needs to be more spaces and nights to accommodate everyone. And I think that's where a bit of the challenge is at the moment, So.
Yeah, I have something like a question about that later that we'll speak. One other question that I want to do is, what were your first places to go to listen to electronic music? I know there was a lot of raves. I don't know if you started going to raves, or if there's some other places where you used to go partying your first times.
Where would I have gone? I mean, there was, there's a few places I don't actually know what the names of them were, because there were a few places. If I remember correctly, one of them was called the Underground Cafe. I think that was the name of it, but it was sort of like an after hours place that literally was like a cafe, and where you could kind of listen to music and stuff. And that was in excuse me, that was in Dublin on Dame Street or somewhere like that. There was one particular time one particular place that I remember we went to sometimes, not only after a club, but I think we went to on other nights when we hadn't gone to a club. But I suppose back then, a lot of kind of like raves, at least legal ones, let's say, you could be 16 and get into those. In fact, you could go to normal clubs at age 15, or younger. Yeah, there was.
But when were the first clubs made in Dublin?
When were the first clubs? Oh, well, listen, we have, obviously, like most places, we would have had nightclubs going back to the late 60s, 70s, kind of thing. Yeah, but I mean, like, if you're talking the 60s, you're talking about places that were in old stately mansions and old kind of like manor houses, like, the kind of the aristocrats of the area, typically coming from like, wealthy English families and royalty. Some of the, like, one of the early nightclubs in Ireland's Cape, like, was actually started in one of those houses, the Leslie family. And if you actually go back and check out what he's done, he made some really interesting experimental kind of music from back then too. So there's some weird sort of origins of experimental and electronic music in Ireland that a lot of people aren't aware of, that are also part of the origins of our nightclub industry as well, which is really interesting. Sorry that I keep calling.
No, don't worry about it.
I've been trying to shake this the last week or two. But yeah, I think in terms of, so we had a weird kind of nightclub industry. It was quite lawless in the early days, like let's say the 80s and 90s. There was a club in Dublin which was just before my time in terms of going out. It was called the Asylum, and it literally was like an asylum. I was insane. All of the stories. It has a reputation, and it has a reputation that was so bad that when they tried to open up the space for just one-off night about a decade or 15 years later, the police like cordoned off the road and
they went straight there, right?
Yeah, they weren't going to ever let that place open again, So
that was when it was so crazy.
It was pretty crazy, but there was a lot of there was unfortunately, like a lot of clubs from back then, There was too much of a gangster element and connection to us. There was a shooting or two outside us. There was that sort of stuff, that kind of element, and there were kind of rival gangs meeting each other there. There was a lot of very kind of open drug use, but like hard drugs, you know. It was a tough club, but some big DJs played there, and some of the kind of legendary old school Dublin DJs would have played there, and from up north as well. So they were sort of the ones that had a big reputation. But I would have been going to places like the Ormond Multimedia Centre, or there was another place called the SFX, which put on some really good, which was a live venue, but which also would have put on great club events and stuff like that. So I would have seen people like, you know, Moby or Carl Cox or some of those kind of acts then who you know.
Like in SFX, you mean?
In the SFX, this would have been in like 95 or something like that. So you're 95, 96. So, like I said, you didn't have to be 18 to go to these things. You could be 15 or 16, you know. So it was great. So, but we didn't ask any questions. We weren't kind of. It was only afterwards we realised, oh yeah, well they could do that because they weren't serving alcohol. But we didn't really care if they were serving alcohol or not, you know. So it was. But yeah, there were some of the places, and then over time there was other clubs like the Kitchen, Switch. Some of the bigger places were like the Red Box. We had other clubs like the Temple Theatre, which I played in once, but it wasn't really a place that I went to. But that was a legendary club as well. We had some really the Temple Theatre. Yeah, it was a little bit more like for the hard dance, like trance, hard house. If you look back on it and its kind of cultural impact, I mean, it was. Yeah, it's definitely a very important club in terms of like Irish clubbing.
Is it still open or?
No, it's closed many years. I think the two big names that came from that are Brian Carney and John O'Callaghan, who went on to be quite world famous trance producers. There's actually a documentary that they have up online where they go back and they sort of like they go back to the building outside. They talk about their memories of the place. So you know, I think over time, as you get older as well, you do gain a greater appreciation for other music styles and what other people are doing in the scene, as opposed to just staying in your lane and going, oh yeah, I don't like trance or whatever it is, or such and such is cheesy, you know, and don't give it any time. Over time, I've kind of developed a much greater appreciation for that whole movement because it was very, very important to Dublin. And Dublin needed clubs like that to move to after the rave scene sort of was dismantled by the mid-90s. By the time I was going out properly to clubs, the rave scene had already, the old rave scene had already kind of ended. But it needed, because there were so many people still listening to this music, and as the music
they need a place to go, right?
They need a place.
They need a place to go.
And the Temple Theatre was the place for a number of years. Even though it wasn't a place that I was in once, I played in it once. Maybe I was in it one other time for that same night, but by and large it wasn't. The Kitchen was a really good small club as well. That was U2's club actually, and that was where I played one of my first gigs as well. So there was a lot of good clubs in Dublin, but looking back, I still feel, yeah, it always felt like we could have just done that. I don't know, if we'd held on to some of the clubs. It's like every city or even large town or even in some cases villages, there's that important venue that you want to last forever, but unfortunately
you can't.
Very few things last forever, and clubs didn't. A lot of them didn't last out, you know, coming out of the 90s or into the 2000s for too long. So
no, but there was things going on there. I was born like in the late 90s, and I didn't know there was everything going on in Dublin or so.
It was great. Dublin was amazing. Dublin was being tipped as the next big thing, you know. I don't know what it was. I think it must have been because U2 were so big in the 90s, and then they opened up a nightclub, and everybody, it was being tipped as the next, like this was going to be one of the big destinations, you know. And then there was, at a commercial level, you had like the MTV Music Awards in Dublin, and there was just all this hype that was building all the time, and there was that kind of socialite scene, and, you know, people like from the celebrity kind of worlds that just kept visiting Dublin all the time, and everyone was just in Dublin every weekend somehow. And I think that was the U2 effect a little bit, but it seemed like our nightlife could have really gone to the next level then, but it didn't. So
what a pity.
Yeah. Well, it's still good. On a good night, it's still great.
You still live there. You know, the very good times there. You know,
The what?
You lived very good times there in Dublin.
Yeah.
I'm sure now it's not the same, but it's good to know that it was very strong in that. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what inspires me a little bit to keep on pushing and to try to improve our club scene now, because I remember how good it was in the past. And I also feel that a lot of people, both of my generation and older generations again, grew up taking a decent standard or quality of nightlife for granted. It was just there. But I feel very strongly, as do other people in the campaign with me and a lot of people around me, is that we want people that are going out now and future generations to experience even a bit of what we did, or have access to places, and that the whole idea of having a local dance venue and place that you don't even think about being there or not being there, that it's just there. We have to have dance spaces. There's just, if we don't, what do we have? It's like,
with you really.
Yeah, so I think I don't like the fact that this idea of having nowhere is now just being normalised, and that it's almost like if you want to go out and go dancing, that you have to go to some special overpriced one-off events. No, it has to be, nightlife has to be, first of all, it has to be a bit more affordable again.
For everyone.
For everyone, but it does need to start to re-emerge back in the areas that it disappeared from. And that's a big challenge for all of us, I think. So, yeah.
Oh, well, good stories about Dublin.
Yeah.
Well, now we're going to get into your fight over there.
Oh, yeah.
So just we can know about how is it going over there, because we know you're very active. So we have seen you getting into the parliament and fighting for the culture of electronic music. But can you tell us how you got there?
Yeah, I think first of all, the parliament thing, I'm not an elected representative or anything like that, but luckily we made some good links with some politicians who have brought us in to be on committees or to speak in front of parliamentary members, that's so sometimes when you see stuff that's online, sometimes it could be from committee meetings that I'm at, and I am a member of a couple of committees at a local level in Dublin City Council and City Hall, but then some of the other ones you'd see are from our national parliaments. And yeah, listen, we've been running our campaign for 20 years now, actually. Wow. On and off. It never really ended, but there were a number of years as my own DJ career was kicking off, like internationally, I suppose, in about 2010, 2011, 2012.
That's early.
But up till about then, the campaign, I was just continually pushing. But then there wasn't really too much political will or industry will, so I had to kind of put it down for a little while. Like I said, we never ended. But at the beginning of 2018, I kind of relaunched it and got some new people involved in the campaign. And since then, it's just been relentless. We just haven't stopped. We haven't missed a beat. We've just, it's been continual. It's been intense. It hasn't stopped. And we're still in the thick of it now. We're trying to change the laws. We're trying to change licensing laws. We're trying to modernise the laws and nightlife in general, and trying to just change the Irish psyche when it comes to nightlife and our culture and what it is that we do, and the fact that we need to have a place, we just because we like to go out after a certain time doesn't mean that we should be discriminated against, And I do honestly believe that it's it is a borderline. It is discrimination. It's bigotry. It's discrimination against, largely against young people, but particularly about music styles as well. If it was traditional music that was playing later into the night, I think there would be a softer approach or attitude towards us. But even at that, I think it wouldn't just end there. I think in general in Ireland we're very conservative, authoritarian in terms of our approach, including with policing, and it's tough, and it hasn't really changed over the years. And now at the moment as well, we've seemingly got a shortage of police as well, and that doesn't bode well when you want to kind of change and extend closing times and stuff like that. So we want there just to be a sustainable business model out there so that people can open a nightclub and hopefully survive and have enough hours to trade. But similarly, we want more communities. Like, you know, if it was a community like yours in Dublin, you know, we'd want there to be an opening or a way for you to be able to open and run your own venue and space, you know. So they're the kind of conversations we're trying to start and develop. It's difficult because sometimes the people who you're having meetings with, and these are meetings about culture and about recreation and leisure, and you're kind of thinking, some of these people are the last people who I would be choosing to spend my leisure time with, you know. And I know that sounds kind of a little bit insulting, but like, there are people that literally live in a different world, and that's very much a 9-to-5 world. And yes, I'm sure they have a little bit of a social life outside of that. But trying to get them to understand, and some of them do understand.
You know, that's the thing, that they don't understand what the music for us, the electronic music. So you have to explain them and get to them to know about it.
Yeah, and a lot of them are also viewing nightlife through a kind of an older lens of when they went out in the 80s or 90s or early 2000s. That's when nightlife was a little bit wilder, you know. But what I see on the streets now, it's nothing like it was in the old days, you know. And there's a perception now around nightlife that it's really dangerous at night to go out, and in some cases it can be. But I've always found like Dublin to be kind of edgy at night. You know, you have to watch your back. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. No matter where you are. Do you know what I mean? It'd be the same here, I'm sure.
So
if you're going out at night, it's dark, you know, and it's like, you know, you do have to watch yourself. But I don't think that's a reason to just try and shut it all down, you know. And I think one thing we do need to sort of push more than ever is just the whole idea that electronic music now accounts for the highest output of recorded music coming from most countries, you know. And they're the kind of statistics and data that we need to promote a lot more, and bring this data to all of the relevant people in our countries to show them why it's important, and to show them as well that a lot of younger people now are going straight to making music on their computer, getting a controller keyboard, getting pads, doing whatever it is they need to do to create, you know. And that's, I think it's already naturally happening, but I think we need to push that picture a little bit more in terms of, you know, the kind of support then that it will get, you know. So,
well, I hope with Give Us the Night, you can get to that where you want, you know.
Yeah, it's going to be a long, I think with the licensing stuff, we definitely want to be able to change the times and licensing soon. And once that's out of the way, then maybe we might reshape as a group. You know, we might change our name, because at that point we would have got the night, you know. But I still think we have a little bit of a fight left. We're coming up to an election now.
You're nearly there, right?
We're nearly there. They've drafted a bill. It's not everything that it could be, but it'll be enough to make a difference. So. But they haven't published it. See, they need to publish it, and then it needs to be properly debated in Parliament, and then it'll be enacted into law. But they've drafted the bill, but they haven't published it. And they haven't published it because we were in the run-up to an election, and they just got a little bit scared about how that might look because of the whole law and order, policing, all the negative stuff, you know. And it's just for us, it's just such a moderate change. It's not an extreme... Like, it's not a radical change that's being proposed.
It'll be normal for people. It's not going to be something...
No, it just means that some clubs could open till 6 o'clock, I mean, and in most cases they wouldn't be opening till that time anyway. And it means then as well the pubs and live venues can open to the same time, like 12:30, 1 o'clock every night, you know, and that'll be it, you know. So it's not, that they're the main changes in terms of closing times, you know. And then also we want to kind of reduce the costs, but let's see what happens.
Well, I hope step by step you can get into it.
Yeah.
So I'll go with another question about the scene. I don't know what you think about, we were speaking about before about this. What do you think that some people say that techno is commercial? And because I've been lately seeing that some DJs, they're saying that techno is commercial. We were speaking about it, that now maybe the people that were before, they don't see it like now. And I don't know what you think about it.
I think that commercial element, if you want to call it that, or kind of mainstream sounding stuff, has always been there, but it just hasn't been as prominent. And I think like what I'm seeing with some of that stuff, and with the greatest of respect to some of that stuff, that a lot of that sound was something that used to be quite popular for people in their early journey before they reach adulthood, up until about 16. And a lot of it would be in very large spaces, the kind of spaces that it's still played in today. But what I sort of surprised me a little bit is how there has been such a prolonged stage of this stuff in clubs. Quite often people get that out of their system by the time they hit 16 or 17. And then they're kind of like looking for the more specialist stuff then after that. But listen, I want to be kind of careful what I say here, because I'm not like, this isn't me hating on that or say, because I don't want to like judge other people's music. But I do think that overall, yeah, maybe the sounds that we hear in clubs aren't as maybe groundbreaking or underground as we've kind of heard in the past, you know, and it definitely, the groove isn't being heard as much. Okay, I know there's like hard groove and all that sort of style and all the rest, but I think like in general, like, I mean, house music doesn't seem to, where's house music gone, do you know?
House music
is almost nowhere now. And I know some people have their own perceptions of what house music is, same way some people
we mean about Chicago music.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't have to be strictly just Chicago, but I do think, like, tempos-wise, I love fast tempos. I love really fast tempos, so I'm not going to knock fast tempos, but I would like to see a little bit more in the middle, and I would like to see people being encouraged to go out and dance rather than be kind of just assaulted by the music all the time. And when I say assaulted, it's not just in terms of the heaviness, it's in terms of the speed. And I think overall, if dance music and clubs continue to only play, or for the most part play super fast tempos, that's not actually good overall for club culture and for the business of clubs as well, you know. And I think that's something it needs to maybe review over time. But quite often this kind of comes around in a kind of, you know, in cycle, and it'll change when it needs to. But I do, I don't know, I think it would be nice to see, it's so expensive to go out now and to sustain and keep the doors open in a club and in a space, that it's very hard for those smaller spaces and for those upcoming acts to sort of be able to be in existence and to have, you know, that kind of breeding ground to do what it is that they do. It exists, but it's just not as strong as it could be, you know. So I think, so in ways I don't want to focus too much on all the sort of like hard and fast and commercial stuff, because I think it's good that scene is doing what it's doing. But I suppose I have been a little bit surprised for how long it's kind of stayed in the place that it has, and that it's actually been on the weekly agenda in clubs, whereas before it was a little bit more, in some cases, seasonal, or not as much, or if it was as much, it was in very particular regions of Germany or places, or Holland or places like that. Now it's kind of more widespread. But listen, I think let everyone have their fun. I just hope that, like, when it comes to the end of, when that starts to wind down a little bit, that some of them find other sounds, maybe start to experiment a bit more, because I think there'll be a lot of them. And actually the sound design on some of this stuff, like, I mean, there's some really good producers out there. Overall, like anything that becomes popular, it starts to sound quite similar and a little bit samey or whatever. But I'm definitely convinced that there's a lot of great producers that will come from that scene that might like to make more industrial, slowed down, doomier kind of sounds. So I think there's definitely a lot of good that will come from that scene. I'm just surprised in ways that the scene is still going.
I hope that.
I'd like to see just more. But the thing is when you amass such a big following like some of those acts have, and when there's so much money on the line, and when it's become big business, the changes and the shifts can be just a little slower, you know. Everything seemed to change so quickly in the 90s. Now it's kind of it's the opposite of that almost. So it's interesting. It just shows though that things are always kind of moving in some kind of way.
Well, let's see where do we go now? You know, because like you were saying, it's been a long time.
Yeah,
this music has been there. So let's see if it moves, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think the techno scene, just one last thing, the techno scene that we have to kind of just realise is the techno scene was always a bit underground. It was always small. So you could argue now that it's no smaller or bigger than it ever was. And how big do we want it to be as well? Unfortunately, because of social media and stuff like that, we're being forced force-fed a lot of stuff that we don't want to see, that normally we wouldn't be looking at at all.
Yeah.
So are things that different overall, really, you know? I don't know, but I do think, like, the techno scene peaked and saturated. It got a little bit saturated overall. Maybe saturated is the wrong word, but it definitely peaked. But I don't think, like, saturation or more people being into the music is something that we should fear or say is a bad thing either. Like, but I do think, going back to what we were talking about earlier, about the roots of techno and it being an experimental music form, and I have to say this to myself as well, even in my own music production, it is about trying to do something that's different to the next person. I think a lot of these online tutorials, as great as they are to find out, like, how to make certain styles or sounds, I think when all of that wasn't there in the past, a lot of people had to find and experiment until they got there, you know, and the results of getting there then were often the kind of the fruits of their labour.
The same,
So I think that's something now, and just in terms of more people creating their own identity. There's so many great producers out there now, so I don't want to, but I do think, I'm interested to see. I'm always interested to see how the next years go. So yeah.
So we will get now to your label, okay? So well, we see that the music in the label is for me, I like it because it's not only the same style of music.
Yeah.
So how do you do the selection of this music?
It's usually people kind of come to me. I don't always sort of go after the music. Sometimes, like with the compilation I did, like the electro compilation, that was sort of like that was kind of going back in time and kind of focusing on a particular period, like of quite a few years ago. But like, there's a few people that have been on the label, like NX1, for instance. So, you know, when there's somebody like that who sends you music again, then, you know, you might want to do a follow-up by them. So, you know, Feich as well, he's done 3 records on the label. Like, there's people like that who you'll tend to kind of like want to release again. And every so often there's somebody that sends you stuff and just the timing is right for you to go and plan it. But because I'm just sort of running the label on my own, it's probably nowhere near as productive as it could be, you know, and records do take a bit of time to come together, but I don't like to rush stuff either. Sometimes a record comes together really quickly. The Gunjack one came together in just a few months and it was on the shelves. So sometimes that stuff can happen really fast, whereas other stuff can take a year or two to come out. So it really depends. But yeah, a few things coming up, but I think I'm trying not to plan too far ahead at the moment. So yeah.
And well, to finish, I just wanted to ask you if you could tell us some emerging DJs, producers that you are currently looking at.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's loads in lots of different countries and stuff. I suppose I might just, for the purpose of this, maybe just keep it Irish, actually, just sort of like some local people. So there's a few that are sort of at a level who've already kind of established themselves, but there's a few kind of newer producers. There's a guy called Off Track, and another guy called Chaz Maloney, who are both doing really good stuff and are starting to do more kind of live sets. There's a few other people as well that have been around for a little bit longer than that as well, like, you know, Doug Cooney or...
Doug Cooney is well known.
Yeah, and he teaches actually out in the college where I teach as well. Colleen as well is another one too, but there's a few younger ones as well, like Shannon Blessing as well. I mean, her music has really come on over the last while. Like, I'd say give her another year or two now, I could see her starting to kind of land on a lot more kind of like, you know, well-known labels and stuff like that. Max Aero as well is another one. I mean, there's so many names. I feel like if I mention some, I'm going to leave those out. But no, definitely.
It's some of them, you know.
Yeah, no, it's a really fertile period, I think, now for Irish producers. There's so many kind of coming through, and then again there's some older ones as well. There's like Giles Armstrong, an old friend of mine who like started producing later in life, and he has some records out, some really good ones. John Brain as well, who actually did the first release on this Scars records, which is my friend Fran Harness, who's also a great producer as well. They had a launch night for this last week. So yeah, so it's there's all generations making lots of music, and then there's other people that are making, you know, obviously your Kedemas and Tommy Houligans and people like this, and plenty more besides, you know, who are doing really good records and releases.
Good to know about new people. That's simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, well, I wanted to thank you again for
Yeah.
accepting this interview and having, you know, a small chat.
Yeah.
And well, to thank Lucia and Cinta here too.
Thanks a lot.
The promoters and owners of Quimera.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, and it's been a
yeah,
pleasure.
thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.